Dear listener, pull your armchair a little closer to the fire. Pour yourself a cup of tea and allow me to welcome you back to the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. Nothing ever seems to happen here. Until, of course, something quite dreadful does. You are about to spend a most agreeable few hours in the company of an old friend, Miss Jane Marple. And now, Chapter 1. A quiet morning interrupted. It was one of those perfect October mornings in St. Mary Mead when the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp leaves, and the sun slanted gold across the village green. The cottages, with their thatched roofs and tidy gardens, stood as they had for centuries, a testament to the enduring quietude of rural English life in the post-war years. The 1940s had given way to the 1950s, bringing with them a subtle shift in the world beyond. Cars were becoming more common on the narrow lanes, and the wireless brought news of far-off events. But in St. Mary Mead, time seemed to move at a gentler pace. The church clock struck 10 with its familiar measured chimes, and the postman cycled past, waving to Mrs. Price Ridley as she tended her rose bushes. Birds twittered in the hedgerows, and a faint mist lingered over the meadows where cows grazed contentedly. It was a morning that promised nothing more exciting than a stroll to the village shop, or perhaps a game of bridge in the afternoon. Miss Jane Marple sat in the window of her small drawing room in Danemead, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a baby's jacket in pale lemon wool. At 81, or was it 82? She no longer bothered to count. Miss Marple's eyes were as bright and her mind as sharp as ever. Her frail appearance, with her white hair neatly pinned and her lace-trimmed blouse, belied the keen observer beneath. She had seen much in her long life, the follies of youth, the secrets of middle age, and the regrets of the elderly. Human nature, she often reflected, was remarkably consistent, whether in the grandeur of a London drawing room or the simplicity of a village cottage. As she knitted, her gaze wandered to the garden outside, where the last of the Michaelmas daisies bloomed in purple splendor against the fading greens of autumn. The gardener, old Laycock, was raking leaves with slow, deliberate strokes, his pipe clenched between his teeth. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Laycock reminded her of a gardener she had known in her youth, a man with a penchant for tall tales and an unfortunate habit of borrowing tools that were never returned. The peace was shattered by the hurried tapping of heels on the garden path. The door burst open, and in rushed Clara Beecham, the daily help, pink-cheeked and breathless. Clara was a sturdy woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense manner and a fondness for gossip that made her an invaluable source of village news. Today her apron was askew and her eyes were wide with excitement, or was it shock? "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful," Clara exclaimed, clutching her chest as if to steady her racing heart. "Old Mr. Trevelyan, he's dead. Found this morning in his study at Gossington Hall. The doctor says heart failure, but there's talk. Talk that it might not have been natural." Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate calm, her expression unchanging. She had long ago learned that panic achieved nothing. Better to observe and reflect. "Heart failure, you say? How very convenient for somebody. Sit down, Clara, and tell me everything from the beginning. Would you like a cup of tea? There's a fresh pot on the table." Clara collapsed into a chair, fanning herself with her hand. "Tea? Oh yes, miss, that would be lovely. My nerves are all a jangle. It was the maid at Gossington Hall who told me, young Elsie, you know, the one with the freckles. She found him this morning when she brought in his breakfast tray. Slumped over his desk he was, with his stamp album open in front of him. Cold as ice, she said. She screamed the house down and Mrs. Brewster came running." Miss Marple poured the tea, adding a generous spoonful of sugar to Clara's cup. Sugar for shock, as her old nanny used to say. "And the study window, was it open?" Clara nodded vigorously, taking a sip that seemed to steady her. "Wide open, miss, though the night was bitter cold, and the French window onto the terrace too. Elsie said it was most peculiar, as the colonel always complained of drafts. And the safe was standing open but nothing taken, they say. The police have been called, but Dr. Haydock arrived first and pronounced it heart failure. But you know how people talk in the village. The colonel wasn't liked, miss. Not liked at all. Indeed, Colonel Lucius Trevelyan was not a man to inspire affection. Miss Marple recalled him well. A tall, gaunt figure with a military mustache and a bark that could curdle milk. He had retired from the Indian Army some 20 years ago, bringing with him a fortune amassed in the colonies and a temper honed by years of command. Gossington Hall, his imposing Georgian residence on the edge of the village, stood as a symbol of his status, grand, isolated, and somewhat forbidding. The colonel had quarreled with nearly everyone, the vicar over church funds, the farmers over rights of way, even the postman over a misdelivered letter. Only last week at the village fete he had publicly berated Captain Roger Hale, his nephew, for some imagined slight. Miss Marple had overheard the exchange while judging the flower arrangements. The colonel's voice had carried across the green like a gunshot. "Tell me more about the safe," Miss Marple prompted gently, her mind already turning over possibilities like stones in a garden path. "What was kept in it?" Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Papers, miss. Important papers, and the colonel's new will. He'd just made it a month ago. Mrs. Brewster mentioned it to me once when I was helping with the spring cleaning. He cut out half the family, she said, and left everything to some charity. The Home for Fallen Women in Much Benham, if you can believe it. The old will favored the relatives, but this new one, well, it caused quite a stir." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Wills were often at the heart of such matters. She had seen enough in her time to know how they could twist loyalties and breed resentment. "And who was in the house last night?" "The usual lot, miss. Mrs. Lavinia Brewster, the colonel's niece. She's kept house for him since her husband died in the war. Then there's Miss Philippa Donn, the secretary, a quiet sort, but sharp as a tack. Geoffrey Donn, her cousin, the artist. He's been staying on and off, borrowing money from the colonel, or so they say. And Captain Hale dropped by yesterday afternoon, though he left before dinner. The butler and the maids, of course, but they sleep in the attics." As Clara spoke, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the inhabitants of Gossington Hall. Mrs. Brewster was a plump, flustered woman of 55, always bedecked in too many jewels as if to compensate for her plain features. She had devoted herself to her uncle with a mixture of duty and desperation, for her own finances were precarious. Captain Hale, handsome and charming in a superficial way, had a reputation for fast living and slow repayments. The colonel had bailed him out more than once, but patience has its limits. Miss Philippa Donn was younger, 28 perhaps, with a cool efficiency that masked deeper emotions. And Geoffrey, the unsuccessful artist, forever chasing dreams and creditors alike. Motives, Miss Marple mused, were like weeds in a garden. They sprouted everywhere if one looked closely. By the time Clara finished her tea and bustled off to her next chores, the sun had climbed higher, casting warm light across the room. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, but her mind was far from the lemon wool. Heart failure could be natural, of course. The colonel was 76 and his habits were hardly healthful. Curry every Friday night, rich and spicy, washed down with brandy. But an open window on a cold night, an empty safe with nothing stolen? It smacked of deliberation, of an elaborate scheme designed to mislead. She rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the village. The green was alive now with morning activity. Children skipping to school, the baker's van making deliveries, Mrs. Price Ridley still at her roses, no doubt gleaning tidbits from passers-by. News traveled fast in St. Mary Mead. By luncheon, the whole village would know. Miss Marple decided a walk was in order. Fresh air cleared the mind, and one never knew what one might overhear at the grocer's or the post office. Stepping out into the crisp air, she adjusted her hat, a sensible felt with a small feather, and made her way down the lane. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the scent of burning bonfires wafted from distant fields. As she passed the vicarage, the Reverend Clement emerged, his cassock flapping in the breeze. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Fine day, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Vicar, though I hear there's been a sad occurrence at Gossington Hall." The vicar's face clouded. "Ah, yes, poor Colonel Trevelyan. A shock, to be sure. Dr. Haydock telephoned me earlier. Heart failure, he says. I'll be arranging the funeral, of course. Such a pillar of the community, generous with his donations, if a bit gruff." Miss Marple smiled inwardly. Generous when it suited him, perhaps. "Did you see him recently?" "Only last Sunday after service. He seemed in robust health, arguing with the organist about the hymns. Quite his usual self." They parted ways, and Miss Marple continued to the high street. At the grocer's, Mr. Polk was serving a queue of customers, all abuzz with the news. "Found dead at his desk," one woman was saying. "And the safe open. Mark my words, it's foul play." "Nonsense," retorted another. "The man was old. Hearts give out." Miss Marple purchased a tin of biscuits and lingered, listening. Bits and pieces emerged. The colonel had dined alone on curry prepared by the cook. He had worked late on his stamp collection, a hobby that consumed him. No one had heard anything unusual in the night. But then Gossington Hall was large, its rooms thick-walled. As she walked home, Miss Marple pondered the stamps. The colonel's collection was famous in philatelic circles, worth a small fortune. Had someone been after that? Or was it a red herring meant to distract from the real prize, the missing will? Back at Danemead, she settled into her chair with a light lunch of soup and bread. The afternoon stretched ahead, but she knew it would not be idle. Invitations would come. In times of crisis, people sought the comfort of tea and conversation. Sure enough, by 3 o'clock, a note arrived from Mrs. Brewster inviting her to Gossington Hall for tea. "In this sad time," it read, "your presence would be a comfort." Miss Marple accepted, of course. Comfort was one thing, observation was another. As she prepared to go, changing into her best wool dress and pearl brooch, she reflected on the village's warm community. St. Mary Mead was a place where neighbors helped one another, where secrets were shared over fences and scandals whispered in confidence. But beneath the coziness lurked the same passions as anywhere else. Greed, jealousy, love gone wrong. The elaborate scheme, whatever it was, would unravel in time. Human nature always did. The walk to Gossington Hall took her past the meadows where sheep grazed under the golden light. The hall itself loomed at the end of a tree-lined drive, its red brick facade softened by ivy. As she approached, she noted the police car parked discreetly by the stables. So the authorities were taking an interest after all. Interesting. Mrs. Brewster greeted her at the door, her eyes red-rimmed but her diamonds sparkling. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank you for coming. It's all so dreadful." There, my dear," Miss Marple said soothingly, patting her arm. "Let's have that tea and you can tell me everything." They settled in the drawing room, a grand space with chintz sofas and portraits of stern ancestors. As the tea was poured, the others arrived, Captain Hale, looking dashing but strained, Miss Philippa, composed as ever, Geoffrey Donne, disheveled and artistic. Even Dr. Haydock dropped in, his medical bag in hand. Conversation turned inevitably to the colonel. "Perfectly well yesterday," Mrs. Brewster said, dabbing her eyes. "He ate a huge dinner, curry, his favorite, and then worked on his stamps until midnight. Funny he should die the night after telling me I'd never see a penny," Captain Hale muttered, lighting a cigarette. The new will was mentioned, the charity beneficiary, the family cut out. Motives hung in the air like smoke. Miss Marple listened, her mild eyes missing nothing. The elaborate scheme was beginning to take shape in her mind, piece by piece. Chapter 2. The Heirs and the Disinherited. The invitation card had been delivered by hand shortly after luncheon, the heavy cream paper still bearing the faint scent of lavender water that Mrs. Lavinia Brewster affected. Miss Marple turned it over in her delicate fingers, noting the black border already printed. Rather premature, she thought, but then Lavinia had never been one to let an opportunity for mourning pass unmarked. By 3 o'clock she was walking up the gravel drive of Gossington Hall, her sensible walking shoes crunching softly, her umbrella hooked over one arm, though the sky was cloudless. The house rose before her, handsome and symmetrical, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. A constable stood awkwardly by the front steps, looking out of place among the chrysanthemums. Mrs. Brewster received her in the morning room, a smaller apartment than the grand drawing room, and therefore, Miss Marple reflected, more suitable for confidences. Lavinia was already dressed in full mourning, black silk that rustled importantly, a jet brooch at her throat, and a handkerchief perpetually pressed to her eyes, though no tears had yet fallen. "Oh, Miss Marple," she began at once, "how good of you to come. I declare I scarcely know whether I am on my head or my heels." "Poor dear Uncle Lucius, taken so suddenly." Miss Marple murmured sympathy and allowed herself to be settled on a brocade sofa beside a tea-table already laid with Worcester china and a silver spirit kettle hissing gently. The room smelled of beeswax and dried rose petals and faintly of the curry that had been the Colonel's dinner the night before. Before Mrs. Brewster could ring for the maid, the door opened again and Captain Roger Hale strode in. He was 40, bronzed from foreign suns, with a guardsman's figure beginning to run a little to seed and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He greeted Miss Marple with exaggerated charm, then threw himself into an armchair, stretching out long legs in perfectly pressed flannels. "Well, Aunt Lavinia," he said without preamble, "I suppose we must talk brass tacks. Where do we stand? Uncle Lucius was always threatening to cut me off with a shilling, but a fellow has to live." Mrs. Brewster flushed. "Roger, really, the body is scarcely cold." "Cold since 8 o'clock this morning," he returned, "and the lawyer can't be put off forever." "What about this famous new will everyone's whispering about?" At that moment the door opened once more and Miss Philippa Donn entered, notebook in hand, spectacles gleaming. She was tall, pale, impeccably neat in a charcoal skirt and white blouse. Behind her trailed Geoffrey Donn, her cousin, untidy fair hair falling over a Byronic collar, paint beneath his fingernails, and the faintly hunted look of a man perpetually behind with his bills. Philippa inclined her head politely. "Mrs. Brewster, the undertaker's telephoned for instructions. And Dr. Haydock is here." Dr. Haydock followed almost on her heels, carrying his bag and looking, as always, as though he would rather be fishing. He nodded to Miss Marple with the affectionate exasperation of an old friend. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Keeping well?" "Good, good. Sad business, this." Tea was poured. Seed cake was handed. Conversation circled warily like cats around a suspicious puddle. It was Philippa who finally spoke the words everyone had been avoiding. "The Colonel showed me the new will only last week. He had me witness it. Everything, house, investments, the stamp collection, is left to the Home for Fallen Women in Much Benham." Captain Hale gave a short, incredulous laugh. £10,000 and more to a parcel of... Well, never mind, I call it a damned insult." Geoffrey Donn crushed his cake to crumbs in restless fingers. "He promised me 500 for my exhibition in the spring. Said it was as good as in the bank. Now it's gone to charity." Mrs. Brewster dabbed at her eyes again. "Uncle Lucius was always eccentric. But to leave me, his only living relative who has kept house for him these 10 years, With nothing but my widow's jointure? Miss Marple sipped her tea and observed. Lavinia's diamonds, brooch, earrings, 3 rings, flashed with every emotional gesture, diamonds that had certainly not been purchased on a housekeeper's allowance. Roger's cufflinks were heavy gold, his tie silk, yet she had heard rumors of duns at his London flat. Geoffrey's shoes were beautifully cut but down at heel, and there was a fresh patch on his coat sleeve. Only Philippa seemed untouched by financial display, her fountain pen modest, her shoes polished but old. "Tell me, Captain Hale," Miss Marple said mildly, "were you at the golf club last evening, as I heard?" He turned the smile on her again. "Sharp as ever, Miss Marple. Yes, from 8 until closing time. Dozens saw me. Lost 25 pounds at bridge, worse luck. And you, Miss Dawn? You were working late, I expect?" Philippa met her gaze steadily. "Until 10 o'clock. The Colonel was cataloguing his new Cape triangles. Then I took him his hot milk and locked up the stamp room myself." Mrs. Brewster gave a little gasp. "The stamp room. The safe is in there. When the police looked this morning, the safe door was open and the new will, gone." Roger Hale sat very still. "Gone or destroyed?" "We shall know soon enough," Dr. Haydock said heavily. "But the old will, made 5 years ago, still stands unless the new one turns up. That leaves the bulk of the estate to Mrs. Brewster and Captain Hale jointly, with legacies to Geoffrey and Miss Dawn." A silence fell, thick as dust. Miss Marple noticed that Philippa's hand, the right one, bore a small court plaster near the thumb, and that Geoffrey was staring at his cousin with an expression she could not quite read. Mrs. Brewster began to cry in earnest. "I can't bear it. Uncle quarreled with everyone. Only yesterday he told Roger never to darken his doors again, and he threatened to dismiss Philippa for carelessness with the accounts." Philippa's lips tightened. The accounts were perfectly correct. "Of course they were, my dear," Miss Marple said soothingly. "The Colonel was always finding fault where none existed. Tell me, did anyone hear anything unusual last night? A car, perhaps? Or footsteps on the terrace?" The answers came quickly. Too quickly. Mrs. Brewster had taken a sleeping powder at 10 and heard nothing. Roger had been 20 miles away at the golf club. Philippa had gone to bed at 10:30 with a headache. Geoffrey claimed to have walked home through the fields at 11 and seen all the windows dark. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "I can confirm time of death between 10 and midnight. Rigor suggests nearer 11, but one can't be precise." Miss Marple set down her cup. "How very curious. The French window onto the terrace was found open this morning, and yet the night was bitterly cold. Colonel Trevelyan loathed drafts." Roger Hale shrugged. "Burglar, perhaps, though nothing seems to have been taken." "Except a will," Geoffrey said under his breath. Tea concluded in uneasy murmurs. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she paused beside Philippa. "That is a nasty little burn, my dear. Have you been near the stove?" Philippa flushed. "Only this morning, helping clear breakfast things." Miss Marple smiled gently and took her leave. Walking slowly down the drive, she turned once to look back at the house. 4 people with motives as plain as signposts, alibis that fitted together a shade too neatly, and a will vanished into thin air. In the distance, she heard the church clock strike 4. Somewhere in Gossington Hall, she thought. Someone was already planning the next move in a very elaborate scheme indeed. Chapter 3. The Little Things That Don't Fit. The days following Colonel Trevelyan's death unfolded in St. Mary Mead with the deceptive calm of an autumn afternoon, where the sun filtered through turning leaves and the air carried the sweet decay of fallen apples. Miss Marple, ever the unobtrusive observer, went about her routine with purposeful serenity. She knitted in her drawing room, strolled the lanes with her basket for errands, and attended the Women's Institute meeting as if nothing were amiss. But her bright eyes missed nothing, and her mind, like a spider at the center of a web, gathered the faint tremors of irregularity that others dismissed as coincidence. It began with a visit to the village dressmaker, Miss Hartnell, a sharp-tongued spinster whose shop on the high street was a hub of sartorial secrets. Miss Marple had ostensibly come to purchase black ribbon for edging a handkerchief. Mourning touches were expected in such times, but her real intent was to inquire subtly about recent orders. As Miss Hartnell measured out the ribbon with precise snips of her scissors, she chatted freely, her voice a mix of indignation and relish. "That Mrs. Brewster," Miss Hartnell said, pinning the ribbon to the counter, "ordered a full mourning ensemble from London 2 weeks ago. Black crepe veil, the lot. Came by special delivery yesterday, but she telephoned for it well before the poor colonel passed. Said it was for a distant cousin's funeral, but we all know she hasn't a cousin left alive. Premature, I call it, most improper." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her knitting needles pausing in her lap. How very foresightful of her, though one wonders why such haste. The colonel was in robust health then, was he not? Robust? He was bellowing at the butcher only last Tuesday about the quality of the lamb. No sign of frailty there. Miss Hartnell leaned closer, her eyes gleaming. But mark my words, there's more to this than heart failure. The police have been poking about Gossington Hall all morning. As Miss Marple left the shop, the ribbon tucked into her basket, she reflected on Mrs. Brewster's order. Mourning clothes were costly, and Lavinia's means were modest. Had she anticipated the death? Or was it mere prudence? Human nature, Miss Marple knew, often hid avarice behind propriety. Her next stop was the golf club, a modest establishment on the outskirts of the village, where gentlemen in +4s gathered to discuss handicaps and politics. She had no business there herself, but her nephew Raymond West, the novelist, was visiting, and had agreed to accompany her under the guise of a leisurely walk. Raymond, with his modern ideas and literary flair, found St. Mary Mead quaintly amusing, but he indulged his aunt's requests with good humor. The club steward, a retired sergeant major named Briggs, was polishing glasses behind the bar when they entered the lounge. The room smelled of leather and cigar smoke, with scorecards pinned to a notice board and a set of clubs propped in a corner. Miss Marple admired the view of the greens while Raymond engaged Briggs in conversation. "Captain Hale was here the night of the colonel's death, I understand," Raymond said casually, ordering a ginger beer. "Regular player, is he?" Briggs grunted. "Regular loser, more like. That night he was in from 8 till close, playing bridge and downing whiskeys. Left his clubs here overnight, picked 'em up yesterday. Muddy as sin they were, though the course has been closed for reseeding since last Friday. No play at all." Miss Marple turned from the window, her expression mild. Muddy golf clubs in dry weather? How curious. Perhaps he walked across the fields. Briggs shrugged. "Fields are dry as bone. No, miss, that mud was fresh, like from a ditch or some such. Odd now you mention it." As they walked back through the lanes, Raymond chuckled. "Aunt Jane, you're incorrigible. What does muddy clubs prove?" "Nothing yet," she replied. "But the path from the golf club to Gossington Hall crosses several damp meadows. If Captain Hale claims he never left the club, why the mud? Little things, Raymond, always the little things that don't fit." The following morning brought a fresh anomaly. Miss Marple was in her garden clipping late roses with small, sharp shears, when Clara Beecham arrived for her daily duties, bursting with news like an overripe plum. Miss Marple, they found bits of the will, burnt to cinders in the kitchen stove at Gossington Hall. Only a corner left with the colonel's signature. The police say it's worthless now. The old will stands. Miss Marple straightened, a thorn pricking her thumb unnoticed. "Burnt in the stove, how very careless. Who discovered it?" "The cook," sifting the ashes for clinkers. She told the inspector straight away. And there's more. Miss Philippa has a burn on her hand, bandaged up tight. Said she did it on the iron, but the maid swears the irons weren't heated that day. Clara bustled inside to start the dusting, leaving Miss Marple to ponder. A burnt will suggested destruction to revert to the previous terms, favorable to the family. But why the stove, where remnants might be found? Amateurish unless intended as misdirection. That afternoon, Miss Marple attended evensong at the church, where the vicar's sermon on forgiveness seemed pointedly aimed at the congregation's whispers about the colonel. Afterward, in the churchyard amid the tilting gravestones, she encountered Mrs. Price Ridley, the vicar's wife, tending the chrysanthemums with vigorous snips. "Shocking business at Gossington," Mrs. Price Ridley declared without preamble. "And now Geoffrey Don flashing money about like a nabob. Sold a painting for £200 yesterday, to a private patron, he says. But everyone knows his daubs aren't worth tuppence." "Where did the money come from?" I ask. Miss Marple admired a particularly fine bloom. "Perhaps a windfall, though timely, isn't it? The colonel had lent him sums before, I believe." "Lent?" "Geoffrey owed him hundreds. The colonel threatened to call in the debts only last week. Now, with the old man gone—" Mrs. Price Ridley trailed off meaningfully. Walking home as dusk fell, the village lamps flickering to life, Miss Marple pieced the fragments together. Premature mourning for Lavinia, muddy clubs for Roger, a burnt hand for Philippa, sudden wealth for Geoffrey. Each a thread, loose and seemingly insignificant, but woven together they formed a pattern of deceit. She paused at her gate, gazing at the stars emerging in the velvet sky. The colonel's death was no accident. It was crafted with care, yet betrayed by these small oversights. Tomorrow, she decided, she would speak to Dr. Haydock about the curry. Little things always told the truth. Chapter 4. The Matter of the Curry. The next phase of Miss Marple's quiet investigation unfolded over a pot of Earl Grey in Dr. Haydock's comfortable consulting room, a space that smelled reassuringly of carbolic soap and old leather-bound medical journals. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind where the sun dipped low early, casting long shadows across the village green and turning the leaves to burnished gold. Miss Marple had telephoned ahead, citing a vague twinge in her knee as pretext, though both knew her real purpose was far from rheumatic. Dr. Haydock, a robust man in his 60s with a no-nonsense mustache and a twinkle in his eye, welcomed her with the familiarity of old friends. He had known Jane Marple since her girlhood days, when she was all braids and curiosity, and he had long since learned to respect the acuity hidden behind her mild demeanor. "Sit down, Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to the worn armchair by the fire. "Tea? Or shall I prescribe something stronger?" "Tea will do splendidly, doctor," she replied, settling herself with her knitting bag on her lap. "Though I dare say a little information might be the best tonic." He chuckled, pouring from a chipped teapot that had seen better days. "I thought as much. This business at Gossington Hall has the whole village in a tizzy. Heart failure, my certificate says, but you're not convinced, are you?" Miss Marple accepted her cup, stirring in a lump of sugar with deliberate care. "The heart is a delicate organ, doctor, but Colonel Trevelyan's was sound enough last month when you examined him for his insurance policy. No irregularities then, I believe?" Haydock leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "None at all. Fit as a fiddle for his age. A touch of indigestion from all that spicy food, but nothing more." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes brightening. "The curry, his favorite dish, prepared every Friday night without fail. Tell me, doctor, could something like digitalis be hidden in such a meal?" The doctor's eyebrows shot up and he set down his cup with a clatter. "Good heavens, woman! Digitalis, that's foxglove. extract used for heart conditions, but in overdose it's deadly poison. Stops the heart cold, mimics failure perfectly. And yes, in a strong curry, the bitterness would be masked entirely by the spices. But where on earth would someone get digitalis in St. Mary Mead? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. Foxglove grows wild in the hedgerows, doctor. Any gardener knows it. Pretty purple bells, but lethal if mishandled. Dried and powdered, it might resemble turmeric or some other spice. And the colonel ate alone that night, did he not? No one else partook. Haydock nodded slowly, his expression turning grave. Alone, yes. The household dined earlier on cold ham. He insisted on his curry piping hot straight from the stove. If you're right, it would explain the pinpoint pupils I noted. A classic sign of digitalis poisoning. I dismissed it at the time, thinking it post-mortem contraction, but now... The conversation paused as the doctor's housekeeper bustled in with a plate of scones, warm and buttery. Miss Marple took one politely, though her mind was elsewhere, turning over the details like pages in a well-thumbed book. The burn on Philippa Dawn's hand, small but telling. Curry powder was pungent, but not hot enough to blister unless handled carelessly. But grinding dried foxglove leaves? That could generate heat from friction, or perhaps a chemical reaction if not done properly. And Philippa, as secretary, had access to the kitchen, ostensibly to fetch the colonel's trays. Philippa Dawn, Miss Marple said aloud, as if testing the name. A capable young woman. Did you treat her burn, doctor? Haydock shook his head. No, she bandaged it herself. Said it was from the iron, but I saw it briefly at the hall. Looked more like a chemical burn to me, raised and red. Not typical of heat. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. The pieces were aligning. The open safe, the missing will, the alibis that overlapped just enough to arouse suspicion. But poison required opportunity and knowledge. Philippa had both, with her secretarial duties and perhaps a smattering of botany from her school days. Yet she was not alone in motive. The conspiracy felt larger, involving more than one pair of hands. As the tea cooled, they discussed the post-mortem possibilities. An exhumation? Haydock suggested reluctantly. If we suspect poison, the inspector might order one. Digitalis lingers in the tissues. But let us not rush, Miss Marple cautioned. The guilty often betray themselves with haste. Better to watch and wait. Leaving the doctor's house as twilight gathered, Miss Marple walked slowly toward home, her umbrella tapping the pavement like a metronome. The village was settling into evening. Lights winked on in cottage windows, the smell of coal fires mingled with the crisp air, and a dog barked distantly. She passed the post office where the postmistress, Miss Weatherby, was lowering the blinds. On impulse, Miss Marple stepped inside. Good evening, Miss Weatherby. A book of stamps, if you please. The postmistress, a wiry woman with pince-nez and a penchant for details, obliged. Dreadful about the colonel, isn't it? And now talk of poison, though that's just gossip, mind. Miss Marple leaned on the counter confidentially. Gossip often has a kernel of truth. Tell me, did anyone post a parcel recently? Something unusual, perhaps. Miss Weatherby thought a moment. Well, now, Geoffrey Donne sent a flat package to London 2 days before the death. Said it was a painting for valuation. Heavy for a canvas, though. A painting, or perhaps dried herbs disguised? Miss Marple thanked her and continued on, her mind whirring. Geoffrey the artist, with his debts and dreams, he might procure the foxglove, Philippa prepare it, and together. At Danemead, Clara had left supper ready, a simple omelet and salad. Miss Marple ate thoughtfully by the fire, the flames dancing shadows on the walls. The curry mattered because it was routine, predictable, the perfect vehicle for murder. But who had stirred the pot? The cook swore she followed the recipe to the letter, but anyone could have added a pinch of death while her back was turned. As night deepened, Miss Marple retired to bed with a volume of herbal remedies borrowed from the lending library. Foxglove. Digitalis purpurea used since ancient times. Symptoms: nausea, irregular pulse, collapse. The colonel had complained of indigestion that evening, dismissed as usual. Little things, always the little things. By morning resolved, she would enlist Raymond to probe the golf club further. The elaborate scheme was unraveling, thread by poisonous thread. Chapter 5. The golf club alibi. The investigation deepened as the weekend approached, with St. Mary Mead basking in the mellow glow of late autumn. Miss Marple, ever methodical, decided that the golf club alibi warranted closer scrutiny. Captain Roger Hale's claim of spending the entire evening there seemed solid on the surface, witnessed by fellow members, drinks tallied on a chit. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that alibis, like pie crusts, could be flaky if prodded gently. She enlisted her nephew, Raymond West, who was staying at Danemead for a few days to escape the clamor of London. Raymond, a successful novelist with a flair for the dramatic, viewed his aunt's village intrigues as quaint fodder for his next book, though he underestimated her at his peril. "Aunt Jane," he said over breakfast, buttering his toast with vigor. "You're turning me into a detective sidekick. What exactly am I to do at this golf club? Pose as a caddy?" Miss Marple smiled over her teacup, the steam curling like faint question marks. "Nothing so theatrical, dear boy. Simply chat with the barman, Mr. Briggs, I believe, and perhaps the steward. Inquire casually about Captain Hale's evening. People remember details when they're not pressed." Raymond raised an eyebrow, his modern skepticism evident. "And you think they'll spill secrets to a stranger?" "People love to talk, Raymond, especially in a club bar where tongues loosen with a pint or two. Mention you're writing a story about village life. That always piques interest." By midday, Raymond set off in his sports car, the engine purring down the lane. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned to her garden where she dead-headed roses with small, precise snips. The air was crisp, scented with earth and distant bonfires, and she reflected on the paths that crisscrossed the countryside. The golf club lay 3 miles from St. Mary Mead, its fairways rolling gently toward the river. A footpath through the fields connected it directly to Gossington Hall, a 20-minute stroll for a fit man like Hale, even in the dark. Muddy shoes in dry weather. It suggested haste, perhaps a detour through a ditch to avoid the main road. While Raymond pursued his inquiries, Miss Marple paid a call on old Mrs. Bantry, a friend from neighboring Gossington village, whose husband had been a colonel himself. Mrs. Bantry's drawing room was a cozy haven of chintz and photographs, with a fire crackling merrily. Over scones and jam, the conversation turned inevitably to the death. "Dolly Bantry," Miss Marple said, accepting a second scone. "You know everyone at the golf club. Was Captain Hale a regular?" Mrs. Bantry nodded, her eyes sparkling with gossip. "Oh yes, plays every weekend, though his handicap is dreadful. The night of the murder, well, death, I suppose. He was there all right. My Arthur saw him at the bar around 9, losing at cards, as usual. But Arthur left early. Said Hale was still going strong." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And the club closes at 11, I believe." "Sharp on the hour. The steward's a stickler." As Miss Marple walked home, the sun dipping toward the horizon, she pondered the timeline. If Hale had slipped out mid-evening, he could have reached Gossington Hall by 10, done the deed, and returned by 11. Muddy from the fields, but alibi intact. But why the risk? Desperation, perhaps? Rumors of his debts were rife. The colonel's fortune would solve everything. Raymond returned as dusk fell, his car crunching gravel in the drive. He burst into the drawing room, cheeks flushed from the chill air, and flung himself into a chair. "Aunt Jane, you were right. Briggs the barman remembers everything. Hale arrived at 8, ordered a whiskey, joined a bridge game. But at 10:15 he excused himself, said he needed air, and left by the side door. Returned just before 11, disheveled, shoes caked in mud, and paid for a round with a crisp 5-pound note. Unusual, Briggs said. Hale's usually on tick till payday." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. A 5-pound note, fresh from the colonel's safe, perhaps? Raymond stared. "You think he robbed his own uncle?" "Not robbed, staged, to suggest burglary, but the mud gives him away. The course was closed, dry as bone. Only the fields to Gossington are boggy near the stream." That evening, over supper of shepherd's pie prepared by Clara, Raymond expounded his theories with literary enthusiasm. "It's like a plot from one of my novels. The dashing nephew, the poisoned curry, the midnight dash across the moors. Fields," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Not moors, dear, and not midnight. 10:15. Precision matters." The next morning brought confirmation. Miss Marple, strolling to the post office, overheard 2 caddies chatting outside the grocer's. "Captain Hale's clubs," one said. "Left 'em overnight, mud all over the irons like he'd been hacking through a swamp." She purchased stamps and returned home, her mind mapping the route. A quick detour to the library yielded an ordnance survey map, which she spread on the table. The footpath twisted through meadows, crossing a ford that was always muddy after rain. No rain that week, but the ford held water year-round. Hale must have splashed through in haste. By afternoon, Inspector Craddock arrived at Danemead, his notebook in hand. A polite young man from Scotland Yard, he had crossed paths with Miss Marple before and knew better than to dismiss her insights. "Miss Marple," he said, accepting tea. "We've questioned Hale. Sticks to his story. Never left the club. But the barman contradicts him now after some pressing." She nodded. "And the 5-pound note? Traceable?" "New issue from the bank in Much Benham. The colonel withdrew several the day before his death, for his stamp purchases, the dealer says." Craddock jotted notes. "You're suggesting Hale slipped out, murdered his uncle, rifled the safe, burnt the will, and returned? With help, perhaps. The dog didn't bark. Familiar intruder." As Craddock left, Miss Marple sat by the window, watching leaves swirl in the wind. The alibi cracked like thin ice. Hale's movements placed him at the scene. But the telephone call at 11:07, after death, pointed to an accomplice inside the house. Philippa, with her imitative skills. The scheme grew clearer, intricate as her knitting pattern. Tomorrow the sealed room awaited examination. Little by little, the truth emerged. Chapter 6. The sealed room that wasn't the arrival of Inspector Dermot Craddock from Scotland Yard brought a touch of official gravity to the proceedings at Gossington Hall, transforming the cozy village mystery into something more structured, though no less intriguing. It was a crisp Monday morning, the kind where frost rimed the grass and one's breath hung visible in the air like unspoken secrets. Miss Marple had received a polite note from the inspector the previous evening, requesting her presence at the hall for an examination of the study. She accepted, of course. Such invitations were rare, but always fruitful. Bundling herself in a warm woolen coat and scarf, she set out early, her steps measured along the lane where hedgerows sparkled with dew. The village was stirring. The milkman clattered his bottles, children scampered to school with satchels swinging, and the church bell tolled 9 with solemn regularity. Gossington Hall loomed ahead, its facade stern under the pale sun, police tape fluttering faintly at the gates like misplaced party streamers. Inspector Craddock met her at the door, a young man in his 30s with a courteous manner and sharp eyes that missed little. He had encountered Miss Marple on previous cases and held her in high regard, though he sometimes wondered at her unassuming methods. "Miss Marple," he said, shaking her gloved hand, "thank you for coming. Your insights have been invaluable before. Shall we proceed to the study?" They walked through the echoing hall, past portraits of stern Trevelyan's glaring down from gilt frames to the study at the rear. The room was as the colonel had left it, or rather as the murderer had arranged it. Heavy oak desk cluttered with stamp albums and magnifiers, leather armchair askew, bookshelves lined with military histories and philatelic tomes. The safe in the corner stood open, empty save for a few envelopes. But it was the French windows that drew their attention. Twin doors leading to the terrace, one pane cracked, latch forced with evident violence. Splinters of wood littered the carpet like accusing fingers. Craddock knelt to examine them. Forced from the outside clearly, pry marks on the frame, fresh paint chips. A burglar, perhaps, surprised the colonel and induced the heart attack. Miss Marple stood by the window, her gaze wandering to the terrace beyond, where flagstones led to manicured lawns sloping toward the fields. A burglar, Inspector? Yet the colonel's watchdog, that elderly spaniel, Jock, I believe, did not bark once that night. The butler mentioned hearing nothing unusual. Craddock straightened, brushing dust from his knees. True. Jock sleeps in the hall, but he's half deaf these days. Still, a stranger might have roused him. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly, the intruder was no stranger at all. Someone the dog knew well, saw daily. A family member, say, or a frequent visitor. The inspector nodded thoughtfully, his notebook flipping open. Captain Hale, for instance. His alibi has holes, as you suggested. But the study door was locked from the inside, key in the lock. The only other key was on the colonel's ring in his pocket. No way in or out except these windows, and they were forced outward, not in. Miss Marple moved to the door, her fingers tracing the heavy oak panel. It was solid, no signs of tampering. Beyond it lay the corridor to the main house. To the side, a smaller connecting door to the library, half hidden by a bookcase. She pushed it gently. It swung open without resistance. This door, Inspector, was it checked? Craddock frowned. The library? It's unlocked, but why? Because, Miss Marple interrupted gently, stepping through. One could enter the study. This way, do what needed doing, then exit back to the library, locking the main door from that side using the colonel's own key temporarily removed from his ring. Then slip the key back under the door with a bit of string or wire. Simple as that. The room appears sealed from within. The inspector's eyes widened. By Jove, that's clever. But the forced windows? A misdirection, my dear boy. Done after the fact from inside, pushing out to scatter splinters on the carpet. No burglar would force a window and leave without taking valuables. The safe was rifled, but only the will removed, or so it seems. They examined the safe together, its door ajar, papers in disarray. Miss Marple pointed to faint scorch marks on an envelope corner. The will was burnt nearby, perhaps in haste. Ashes in the kitchen stove suggest the culprit carried them there later. Craddock paced the room, piecing it. So, entry via the library or unlatched window, poison already administered in the curry. Colonel collapses, intruder enters, takes the will, forces the window for show, locks the door cleverly, exits. But who? Miss Marple sat in the armchair, her knitting emerging from her bag like a talisman. Someone familiar, as the dog indicates, someone with knowledge of digitalis, perhaps from gardening or medicine, and someone who could imitate the colonel's voice for that telephone call at 11:07 after he was dead. The inspector stopped pacing. The call to the golf club asking for Hale. The butler heard the colonel answer it in the study. Exactly. But the colonel was gone by then. A gruff bark, easy to mimic if practiced. Philippa Dawn, the secretary. She has a low voice, and she's adept at accents from her amateur theatricals in the village hall. Craddock jotted furiously. Motive? She benefits little from the old will. Love, Inspector, or protection. She's secretly engaged to her cousin Geoffrey. The colonel discovered it, threatened to expose Geoffrey's art forgeries, those old masters he's been selling. And Hale? Debts cut from the will. Together they form a trio, no, a duo perhaps, with Geoffrey peripheral. They stepped onto the terrace, the cold air sharpening their thoughts. Footprints faint in the frost, men's shoes size 10 matching Hale's. He came across the fields, Craddock murmured. Muddy golf shoes. Miss Marple nodded. The scheme. Philippa poisons the curry with foxglove powder, hence her burn from drying the leaves. Hale arrives, they stage the burglary, burn the will downstairs. She makes the call to establish the time, then the key trick. Back inside, Craddock sealed the room anew. We'll test for digitalis residues in the curry bowl and confront them. As Miss Marple departed, the sun climbed higher, melting the frost. The village hummed innocently, but the sealed room was sealed no more, its secrets spilling like light through cracked glass. Chapter 7. The Telephone Call. The revelation of the telephone call came like a sudden shaft of light piercing the fog that had shrouded the events at Gossington Hall, illuminating connections that had hitherto been obscured. It was midweek now, with the village of St. Mary Mead settling into a rhythm of subdued whispers and furtive glances whenever the name Trevelyan was mentioned. Miss Marple, undeterred by the chill that had crept into the air, continued her gentle pursuits. A morning walk to the post office, an afternoon of knitting by the fire, and evenings spent poring over notes scribbled in her neat, spidery hand. But her mind was a hive of activity, buzzing with the discrepancies she had noted. The muddy shoes, the burnt hand, the silent dog. It was during one such evening, as rain pattered softly against the windows of Donmead, that the crucial detail emerged. Clara Beecham, ever the bearer of tidings, arrived sodden from the downpour, her umbrella dripping in the hall. She had been at Gossington Hall earlier, helping with the extra cleaning necessitated by the police presence, and her eyes were wide with the thrill of fresh gossip. "Miss Marple," she gasped, shaking out her coat, "you'll never believe what the butler told me today. There was a telephone call that night, the night the colonel died, at 11:07 to be precise, from the hall to the golf club asking for Captain Hale." Miss Marple set down her knitting, her expression one of polite interest, though her heart quickened. "A telephone call, Clara? How intriguing. And who made it?" "That's the thing, miss. The butler, old Simmons, swore he heard the colonel himself answer the ring in the study. Gruff as ever, barking into the receiver, 'Get me Captain Hale.' Then a brief word or two and hung up. But Dr. Haydock says the colonel was dead by 10:45 at the latest. Rigor and body temperature confirm it. How could he have spoken at 11:07? Miss Marple poured Clara a cup of hot cocoa from the thermos on the sideboard, urging her to sit by the fire. Indeed, how? Unless, of course, it wasn't the colonel at all. Someone imitating his voice, perhaps. A short, gruff exchange, easy enough if one knows the timbre. Clara sipped gratefully, her cheeks regaining color. Imitation? But who? Mrs. Brewster was asleep, drugged with her powder. Miss Philippa was in her room with a headache. Geoffrey had left earlier, and the staff were in their quarters. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Headaches can be convenient, my dear, and rooms have doors that open quietly. Tell me, did Simmons hear the entire conversation? Only the colonel's side, or whoever it was. The golf club confirmed the call. The barman took it and fetched Captain Hale, but he wasn't there. Had stepped out, as we know. The caller hung up abruptly. As Clara departed, fortified against the rain, Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing. The call served a purpose: to establish that the colonel was alive at 11:07, pushing the time of death later and bolstering alibis. Hale, returning muddy at 11, would seem innocent if his uncle was still breathing then. But with death at 10:45, the timeline crumbled. An accomplice inside the house must have placed the call, someone who could mimic the colonel's bark, a voice honed from years of command in India. The next morning dawned bright and cold, the rain having washed the world clean. Miss Marple donned her hat and coat and made her way to the vicarage, where the Reverend Clement was known to have a fine ear for voices from his choir duties. Over tea in the cluttered study, surrounded by sermons and hymnals, she broached the subject casually. "Vicar," she said, "you've heard Colonel Trevelyan speak often enough. A distinctive voice, wouldn't you say? Could it be imitated?" The Reverend looked surprised, his mild face creasing. "Imitated? Well, yes, I suppose it's mostly bluster, short, sharp words. Miss Philippa Donn did a splendid job of it last year at the village pantomime. Had us all in stitches, mimicking the colonel's orders to the gardeners." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Philippa. Yes, she's quite the mimic. From her theatrical society days, I recall." Leaving the vicarage, she detoured past the telephone exchange, a small building manned by Miss Finch, the operator, whose discretion was legendary but whose memory for connections was infallible. Miss Marple inquired politely about recent calls, citing a vague concern over her own bill. Miss Finch adjusted her headset. "Gossington Hall?" "Yes, one outgoing at 11:07 that night, to the golf club. Short duration, under a minute. Placed from the study extension, according to the line. The study, locked from inside, yet the call made after death. The imitator had been in the room, or near enough to use the extension." Miss Marple thanked her and continued to the high street, where she encountered Inspector Craddock buying tobacco at the newsagent's. "Inspector," she greeted him warmly. "A word about the telephone?" Craddock tipped his hat. "You've heard, then. Yes, it's a puzzle. The butler's adamant it was the colonel's voice." "But it couldn't be," Miss Marple said softly. "Unless ghosts use telephones." "No, it was a clever ruse. Wait until Hale was back at the club, visible to witnesses, then call, pretending to be the colonel seeking him. The barman notes the time, the butler hears the voice, and voila. The death appears later than it was." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Philippa Donn? She's the mimic from what I've gathered. And more. Engaged secretly to Geoffrey, threatened by the colonel. She prepares the poison, lets Hale in through the French window, dog knows him, no bark. They stage the scene, burn the will in the stove, her burn mark. Then she makes the call while Hale dashes back." They walked together toward the hall, the inspector mulling it over. "Evidence?" "The little things, Inspector. The burn, the mud, the key under the door." "Test. The curry remnants for digitalis. Foxglove from the garden borders." At Gossington, they found Philippa in the library, sorting papers. She looked up coolly, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hands. "A question, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "That telephone call. Your doing, wasn't it? To protect Roger and Geoffrey?" Philippa paled, but said nothing. Craddock stepped in. "We'll have the truth soon enough." As evening fell, Miss Marple returned home, the pieces nearly complete. The call was the linchpin, unraveling the elaborate scheme. Chapter 8. The final pieces. By the end of that same week, the frost had hardened into a thin, glittering crust over St. Mary Mead, and the village seemed to hold its breath. The inquest had been adjourned, the coroner's jury returning the cautious verdict of death by heart failure, cause uncertain, and the newspapers had already moved on to scandals in London. Yet inside Gossington Hall the tension had thickened like unset jelly. Miss Marple knew the moment had come. She sent out small, innocuous notes on her pale blue writing paper. "I should be so grateful if you would take tea with me at Gossington Hall this afternoon at 4. A few matters need clearing up," and received acceptances from every quarter. People were curious. Curiosity is a powerful lure. At 3:30 she arrived herself, escorted by a quietly triumphant Inspector Craddock, who had spent the morning confirming 2 last details. The drawing-room fire was lit, the curtains drawn against the early dusk, and the tea-table laid with Mrs. Brewster's best spode. One by one they came, Mrs. Lavinia Brewster in rustling black silk, diamonds flashing even in the lamplight, Captain Roger Hale, debonair but with a new wariness in his eyes, Philippa Donn, pale and composed, a fresh court plaster on her right hand, Geoffrey Donn, coat unbrushed, a nervous tremor in his fingers, and Dr. Haydock, who had been asked to drop in professionally. When the maid had poured tea and withdrawn, Miss Marple set down her cup with the small decisive click that always meant business. "Thank you all for coming," she began in her gentle conversational tone. "It has been a troubling time, has it not? A death in the house, a will destroyed, suspicions flying about like autumn leaves. But the leaves have nearly all fallen now, and the pattern is quite clear." Mrs. Brewster gave a little gasp. "Pattern? Miss Marple, whatever can you mean?" "I mean, my dear, that Colonel Trevelyan was murdered, deliberately, carefully," and she allowed herself the faintest of smiles, almost perfectly. A dead silence fell. Roger Hale reached automatically for a cigarette, thought better of it, and let his hand drop. "Let us take it step by step," Miss Marple continued, folding her hands in her lap. "First, the poison, digitalis, derived from foxglove leaves dried and powdered. The Colonel's curry on Friday night was the perfect hiding place. The pungency masked the bitterness. Miss Donn, you prepared the powder yourself, did you not? The small burn on your hand came from the heat generated while grinding the dried leaves in the pestle and mortar." Philippa opened her mouth, closed it again, and stared fixedly at the carpet. "Next, the timing. Captain Hale left the golf club at 10:15, walked across the fields, hence the mud on his golf shoes, and was admitted by the French window which Miss Donn had left unlatched. Jock the Spaniel did not bark because he knew Captain Hale well. The Colonel had already collapsed from the poison. Together you opened the safe, removed the new will, and later burnt it in the kitchen stove. Another source of the burn, Miss Donn, when the ashes flared." Hale's face had gone very white. "This is nonsense. I was at the club all evening." "Except for the 50 minutes you were missing," Inspector Craddock said quietly. "The barman has signed a statement," Miss Marple resumed. "The forced window was done from the inside afterwards to suggest burglary. Then came the cleverest touch. The telephone call at 11:07. Miss Donn, you waited until you knew Captain Hale was safely back at the club, then rang from the study extension and imitated the Colonel's voice perfectly, something you had amused the village with at last year's concert. The butler heard the Colonel speak. The barman noted the time. Everyone assumed the Colonel was still alive at 11. A beautiful false trail." Geoffrey Donn half rose, his voice cracking. "Philippa had nothing to do with—" "Sit down, Geoffrey dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "You were not directly involved except that the Colonel had discovered your little forgeries, those rediscovered old master drawings, and threatened to expose you. Philippa acted to protect you and Captain Hale to secure his inheritance. 2 motives, 1 scheme." Mrs. Brewster burst into noisy tears. "I knew nothing, nothing." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "You merely ordered full mourning 2 weeks early and hoped the old will would stand. A lesser sin." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. The laboratory confirmed digitalis in the remnants of the curry and in the colonel's blood. Enough to fell an elephant? Craddock stepped forward. There is also the matter of the key. The study appeared locked from the inside, yet the murderer escaped. Miss Dawn removed the key from the colonel's ring after death, went out through the library door, locked the study door from the library side, then pushed the key back under the gap beneath the door with a length of black cotton, still caught in the pile of the carpet. Very simple once one knows. Philippa lifted her head at last. Her voice was steady, almost relieved. It was my plan. Roger only helped. The colonel was going to ruin Geoffrey. I couldn't let that happen. Roger Hale gave a short, bitter laugh. And I was tired of being cut off with a shilling. We thought it perfect. It was nearly perfect, Miss Marple corrected gently. But you forgot the little things. Mud on golf shoes when the course was closed, a burn from hot ashes, a dog that did not bark, a telephone call from a dead man, and the pupils of the eyes, pinpoints Dr. Haydock noticed, but thought nothing of it in a supposed heart case. Human nature is untidy, you see. It always leaves traces. Craddock produced handcuffs. Philippa Dawn, Roger Hale, I am arresting you for the murder of Lucius Trevelyan. The room dissolved into movement and tears, but Miss Marple sat quietly, her tea cooling untouched. Outside, the frost glittered under the rising moon and the village slept on, unaware that justice, like winter, had arrived precisely on time. Chapter 9. The Revelation. The drawing room at Gossington Hall had never felt smaller. The fire crackled too loudly, the ormolu clock on the mantel ticked like a heartbeat, and every breath seemed to hang in the lamplight. Mrs. Lavinia Brewster sat rigid on the edge of her chair, black silk gleaming, diamonds glittering with every frightened tremor. Captain Roger Hale stood by the window, one hand in his pocket, the other drumming against the sill. Philippa Dawn was opposite Miss Marple, spine straight, face bloodless, the small court plaster on her right hand stark white against her skin. Geoffrey Dawn hovered behind her chair like a man expecting a blow. Dr. Haydock had taken the corner by the bookcase, arms folded, and Inspector Craddock stood near the door, notebook closed but ready. Miss Marple set her cup into its saucer with the softest possible chink and began to speak, her voice as gentle as if she were discussing the price of eggs. I have asked you all here because the time for pretense is over. Colonel Trevelyan was murdered on Friday night between 10:30 and 10:45. He was poisoned with a massive dose of digitalis, powdered from dried foxglove leaves and stirred into his curry. The poison was chosen because it produces symptoms almost identical to heart failure, and because the colonel's habit of eating alone made concealment easy. Mrs. Brewster gave a strangled sob. Poison! Oh, my poor uncle. Quite, Miss Marple said kindly. Now the murderer needed three things: opportunity, a believable false trail, and the destruction of the new will. Two people supplied them between them. She turned first to Philippa. You, Miss Dawn, prepared the poison. You dried the foxglove leaves in your bedroom. The purple stains on the newspaper lining your drawer were noticed by the housemaid. Ground them in the large pestle from the still room and added the powder to the curry while Cook's back was turned. The small burn on your hand came from the heat of friction and a careless spill of the concentrated powder. You also knew the colonel's voice better than anyone, having taken dictation for years. At 11:07, after he was dead, you telephoned the golf club from the study extension and imitated him perfectly. Put me on to Captain Hale, then rang off. The butler heard a living colonel. The barman noted the time. Everyone's calculations were pushed forward by half an hour. Philippa's lips parted, but no sound came. Miss Marple turned to Roger Hale. You, Captain Hale, left the club at 10:15, walked across the fields, the mud on your golf shoes, the damp hems of your flannels. and were let in by the French window Philippa had unlatched. Jock did not bark because he knew you. By the time you arrived, the colonel had collapsed. You opened the safe, removed the new will, forced the window from the inside to suggest burglary, scattered splinters on the carpet, and carried the will downstairs to burn in the kitchen stove, helping to produce Miss Dawn's second, more serious burn when the flames flared. Hale's handsome face had gone the color of tallow. Absolute rot. I was seen at the club, except for the crucial 50 minutes, Inspector Craddock interjected quietly. We have 3 independent statements now, Miss Marple continued, relentless in her mildness. The study door presented the final puzzle. It was locked from the inside, key in the lock, yet the murderer had left. The answer is charmingly simple. After death, Miss Dawn removed the key from the colonel's ring, stepped through the connecting door into the library, locked the study door from the library side, lay flat on the floor, and pushed the key back under the gap beneath the door with a length of black thread, still attached to a tiny shred of cotton caught in the pile. She then pulled the thread after it and coiled it into her pocket. A trick any child learns with a closed door and a toy soldier. The room appeared perfectly sealed. Geoffrey Dawn made a sudden, clumsy movement. Philippa, for heaven's sake, say it isn't true. Philippa lifted her head at last. Her voice was low, but it carried to every corner. It is true. Every word. The colonel had found out about Geoffrey's forgeries. He was going to the police on Monday. And he had dismissed me without a reference for helping Geoffrey. I would have been ruined and Geoffrey sent to prison. Roger needed money desperately. We thought if the new will vanished, everything would revert to the old one and no one would ever know. Roger Hale laughed, a short, ugly sound. Well, we almost brought it off, a perfect crime spoiled by an old lady who notices burnt hands and muddy shoes. Miss Marple looked at him almost pityingly. No crime is perfect, Captain Hale. Human beings are not neat. They leave fingerprints on life, mud burns, a dog that fails to bark, a telephone call from a dead man, a key returned by a thread. Those are the things that betray us. Dr. Haydock spoke for the first time heavily. The laboratory found digitalis in the curry residue and in the colonel's blood. Enough to kill 3 men. There is no doubt. Mrs. Brewster was weeping noisily into her handkerchief. Geoffrey had sunk into a chair, face in his hands. Philippa sat very still, only the slightest tremor in her clasped fingers betraying that she was still alive. Inspector Craddock stepped forward. Philippa Mary Dawn and Roger Lucius Hale, I arrest you for the willful murder of Colonel Lucius Trevelyan. Anything you say. The rest was formality. Hale made no further protest. Philippa rose without assistance, head high, and allowed the handcuffs to be snapped on her wrists. The fire crackled, the clock struck the quarter, and outside the frost glittered coldly on the terrace where the false burglary had been staged. As the prisoners were led away, Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, the needles moving with calm precision. Such a pity, she murmured to no one in particular. They were both quite clever. But cleverness is never enough, is it? One must also be wise. And in the sudden silence of the drawing room, the truth, like winter itself, settled finally and completely. Chapter 10. Morning tea and reflection. 3 weeks had passed since the arrests, and December had slipped quietly over St. Mary Mead like a clean white counterpane. The frost had given way to a light powdering of snow that lay soft on the thatched roofs and turned the village green into a Christmas card. Holly berries glowed scarlet against the churchyard yew, and the shops on the high street had begun to display paper chains and tinsel in their windows. Life, as it always does in English villages, had resumed its gentle, reassuring rhythm. The scandal of Gossington Hall was no longer shouted, it was spoken of in lowered voices over teacups. And even those voices were already turning to the coming pantomime and the price of coal. At Danemead the fire burned brightly, the kettle sang on the hob, and Miss Jane Marple sat in her accustomed chair, a new skein of pale pink wool in her lap, something for a christening robe, though whose baby it was to be she had not yet decided. The postman had just brought a polite letter of thanks from the chief constable and a rather more effusive one from Inspector Craddock, who wrote that the case against Hale and Philippa Donn was complete. Both had made full confessions, the digitalis traces were conclusive, and the black thread with its tiny shred of cotton had been recovered from the hem of Philippa's gray skirt. Sentences would be passed after the new year. The gate clicked, and a moment later Craddock himself was shown in, snowflakes melting on the shoulders of his overcoat. He looked tired but satisfied, the way a man does when a difficult job is honorably finished. "Miss Marple," he said, taking the proffered chair and accepting a cup of tea with gratitude, "I had to come and say goodbye in person. I'm off to London tonight, and to tell you, though you will have guessed, that without your help we should still be chasing shadows." Miss Marple poured a second cup and added exactly the amount of milk he liked. "Nonsense, my dear boy, you would have arrived at the truth in the end. I merely noticed the little things a little sooner." Craddock smiled. The little things: mud on golf shoes, a burn from hot ashes, a dog that didn't bark, a key pushed under a door with cotton thread. "I shall never underestimate little things again." "Nor should you," she said comfortably. "They are all we ever have, really. Grand motives and elaborate schemes are only the froth on the teacup. Underneath is always the same small, muddy, very human footprint." He stirred his tea thoughtfully. "Philippa Donn asked me to give you a message," she said. "Tell Miss Marple she was right. Cleverness is not enough. I wish I had been wise." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Poor child, she is clever, and she loved Geoffrey in her fashion. Love makes people do extraordinary things, sometimes very cruel ones. But love also leaves traces more than greed ever does." Craddock set down his cup. "And Hale? No remorse there." "Captain Hale is a different creature," Miss Marple said, needles clicking gently. "Handsome, charming, and entirely without conscience. He would have spent the Colonel's money very pleasantly and thought no more about it. There are always a few like that. One meets them in every parish." Outside, the church clock struck 11, mellow and reassuring. A robin hopped across the windowsill, cocked its head at the warmth within, and flew off again. Craddock rose reluctantly. "I must go, the train." "Of course." Miss Marple accompanied him to the door. Snow was falling thicker now, soft flakes drifting past the lamp over the gate. "Take care of yourself, Inspector. London is very noisy after St. Mary Mead." He laughed. "Sometimes I think I should like to be stationed here permanently. Peaceful crimes solved over tea and scones." "Peaceful?" She smiled, a tiny, knowing smile. "There is no such thing, my dear. Only crimes that pretend to be peaceful until someone looks closely." He raised his hat and crunched away down the path. Miss Marple watched until he turned the corner, then closed the door against the cold and returned to her fire. Later that afternoon, Clara Beecham arrived, pink-cheeked from the snow, to find her mistress placidly knitting. "Well, miss," Clara said, hanging up her coat. "They do say Miss Donn has been writing letters to Geoffrey from prison, proper love letters by all accounts." Miss Marple did not look up. "I am not surprised. Young people are very resilient, and love, as I said to the inspector, is a great deal stronger than greed." Clara sniffed. "After what she did." "After what she did," Miss Marple agreed tranquilly. "She still loves. Human nature is a very untidy thing, Clara. That is why it is so interesting." The kettle began to sing again. Miss Marple laid aside her knitting, rose, and moved toward the kitchen. Another cup of tea, I think, and perhaps one of those nice Eccles cakes you brought yesterday. Life must go on, mustn't it? There will be another baby to knit for, another village scandal, another elaborate scheme pretending to be respectable. But for today the snow is falling, the fire is bright, and all is remarkably peaceful. She paused at the window. Children were building a snowman on the green. The butcher's boy cycled past, whistling Good King Wenceslas. Somewhere a piano was practicing carols. St. Mary Mead, having absorbed murder, poison, and betrayal as calmly as it absorbed rain, had already turned its face toward Christmas. Miss Marple smiled, drew the curtain against the gently whirling snow, and went to fetch the Eccles cakes. In the quiet village, justice had been done, love and greed had had their say, and the teapot, as always, was full.